So what is it that causes aging? So aging, I put it to you, is simply a loss of information. I call it the information theory of aging. But I just told you that it's not due to the loss of genetic information. So what is it? Well, there are two types of information in our bodies that are essential for life. One is genetic, and the other is epigenetic. Okay? And you'll probably recall from high school that epigenetic is the term for any process and structure that governs the way the genetic information is packaged and read by the cell. So here's a cartoon of what the epigenome looks like. We've got the DNA, which is in blue. That's our genome. And the genome, I put it to you, is a digital form of information. It is A, T, C, G, 4 bases. This would be, instead of a binary, a quaternary mode of transferring information throughout our life between cells and across the last 4.6 billion, well, at least 4 billion years since we first emerged out of the primordium. And we think that the inability to preserve genetic information is not the cause of aging. It's important for evolution, but over the lifespan of our bodies, we still have a lot of that information intact. Digital is a great way to store information, as you all know. You can copy it without error. Our cells typically do in a large way. So what else is the problem, potentially, in aging? And that's the epigenome, which I'm showing you as these green proteins that wrap up the DNA. Those proteins spool up the genome in the same way you might spool up a garden hose. And when you spool them up very tightly, package that garden hose, your genes in that region of that hose or in that region of the genome will be switched off. And those that are exposed in a big loop, so your garden hose is looped out over the driveway, those are genes that will be switched on. And that's also an essential type of information because it tells each cell what type of cell it should be. All of our cells, essentially all of our cells, have the same genome, but what distinguishes a brain cell from a liver cell and what allows a fertilized egg to become a 26 billion composite of different cell types when it's born is the epigenome. And the epigenome, I believe, is the reason that we age. It is a loss of analog information. Many of you are old enough to remember what analog information is like. If you've ever had a record player or a cassette tape, it's pathetic. You can't copy it very well, you lose information, it degrades over time, it scratches, it's the reason we converted to digital in the late 1990s. But we are built with an analog system of information. This epigenome is useless. But it has to be engineered that way because the epigenome needs to respond very quickly to the environment. It has to have millions of different values rather than very discrete ones. And it also needs to be ready for things that it hasn't ever seen before. One way of thinking of the epigenome is it's the software of our cells, and the genome is the computer or the underlying code. The interesting thing about this whole analog versus digital is it gives us a new perspective on aging. Now, instead of talking about a garden hose and wrapped up proteins, let me show you what it really looks like. Again, a schematic, because I don't have a photo for you. We don't have a microscope that's capable of doing this. So what we're seeing on the left is a young cell. And what we think is going on is that these chromosomes in the black lines are wrapped up in these loops. We call these TADs now. These are called topologically associated domains. And we can now map these with great accuracy. Just in the last few years, we've learned how to do this. And right across the genome, I could do this for your cells pretty easily. And what we see is that these loops of DNA change as we get older. And what that leads to, as you can see on the cell on the right, is that over time, genes that should be off come on and vice versa. And what happens is cells lose their identity. That's really important. A nerve cell in an older person is no longer fully a nerve cell. It's starting to move around in so-called Waddington landscape space or epigenomic space, and it's becoming a different type of cell. A nerve cell in an old person may be partly a skin cell. I mean, think about that. No wonder we start to lose the function of our retina No wonder we start to forget things if our cells don't maintain their epigenomic information. Question is, though, can we slow this down? And can we reset the system? Is there a reboot? Is there a backup hard drive of this early setup that we can access and restore that structure that you're looking at on the left? I believe that it's possible. An analogy I like to use is this compact disc or a DVD here. For the very young in the audience, we used to put music and photos on these things. They were very useful for a moment. But anyway, so they store digital information, which was what was great about them. But what was really sucky about them was that they would get scratched. You had to be very careful with them. And you can see this is a great analogy for aging, because the cells on the right, by this analogy, they still have the information to play the music, to play the concerto that might be encoded in those zeros and ones or those pits in the aluminum foil. But the reader of that compact disc cannot read the songs merely because the laser is skipping and being refracted. But what is great about this analogy is it's very simple in this situation to reset the system. You just get a bit of polish. It's possible you could just get a rag with some toothpaste and polish off those scratches. And guess what? It's brand new. You can read the concerto. And if we're right about aging, it will be possible to essentially do the same to our body and allow our tissues and our organs to play the symphony of our youthful lives once again. But only if there's a backup. We don't know if that's true yet. Now, what the heck is this animal? These are two mice, and you might want to guess which one's older. It's a trick question. They're twins. They're genetically identical twins. And when we read their genomes, we find that their genomes are identical as well. But what we've messed up is their epigenomes. We've scratched up their CD. And you can see what we get is not just a mouse with gray hair, wrinkled skin, and if you could look inside, organs that look old. We haven't just given it diabetes or osteoporosis or dementia. We've given this mouse aging. And as we wrote in the book, Matt and I, if you can give something, you can be sure that you can take it away. So that's what I'll tell you about in a minute. But you might ask, well, David, how do you scratch up that DVD? Of course, you're not taking sandpaper to a mouse, I hope. What we did, and we are going to publish this hopefully shortly. We have manuscripts under review at Cell. There's a couple of manuscripts and 10 years of work out of my lab and 15 others from around the world, is the discovery that broken chromosomes disrupt the structure of those hose reels, that DNA, and cells start to lose their identity, so they don't function very well. And the ultimate outcome of losing cellular identity is aging. Okay. Now, what's really interesting about this mouse is now that we can accelerate aging, we can do a couple of things. We can create a mouse that has the equivalent of 80 years of aging, and we can just induce these DNA cuts in the genome as much as we want. We can make a mouse 80 years old, and we think that these mice will be very useful for finding treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which I think ludicrously people have been using one-year-old mice to study Alzheimer's disease, which to me doesn't make much sense. The other thing we can do that's interesting about these mice, and that we've done, is we can age only part of the animal. We've accelerated aging in the brain of these mice, and we're seeing increased dementia. But interestingly, we can ask the question, do other parts of the body age faster as well if your brain is old? Clearly, we couldn't do that any other way. Now, one of the things that made this all possible, to declare that these mice aren't just sick, but they're actually biologically older, that we've given them aging, is that we can now measure age with great accuracy. This is not qualitative, this is 100% quantitative with machine learning algorithms. What I could do to any of you right now is take a blood sample. Please don't give me any blood samples before I leave. But theoretically, I could even take a buccal swab of your mouth, and I could go back to my lab. I could read what's called the DNA methylome. It's really just measuring which of the letter C's out of those ACTG, which of those have a methyl group, a C and 4 H's on there. And the addition of these chemicals over a lifetime is a really great predictor of your aging rate, because we see them go up in a linear fashion with time. And it turns out if you extrapolate backwards, even a teenage person, teenage girls are aging. Even young infants are aging. Even in the womb we're aging, according to this clock. Now, we used to think that this clock was just a measure of time, like a clock on the wall. But what we've been testing is the idea that perhaps if we move the hands of the clock backwards, in this case, the clock, the biological clock, does time go backwards? Does the age and the health of the animal go backwards? And I'll tell you about that in a second. This is an example of data from the paper that we are hopefully publishing soon. And with Stephen Horvath, who discovered this clock, we can see that the mice that are normal are in blue, and they're aging at a certain rate according to these DNA methyl marks on the DNA. But if we scratch the genome and cause epigenomic changes, we can age the mouse 50% faster. And what's exciting is that pretty much by all measures of these mice, they're 50% older than their counterparts. But then the question arises, if you can cause aging, can you reverse it? And if you do take the clock back, does it do anything? All right, so now I want to tell you about one of my favorite scientists and mathematicians. Many of you may know this person. He used to work down the street at MIT. He worked at Bell Labs as well. And his name is Claude Shannon. And if there's one person that gave rise to the world we live in, the internet age, it's him. And what he proposed in 1948 in a couple of elegant papers called The Mathematical Theory of Communication are a set of diagrams and equations that explain how to preserve information between a sender and a receiver and what to do if there's lost information. And he and his equations gave rise to the TCP/IP protocol and the internet we use today. And you know that if we don't get an email correctly, if it doesn't arrive fully with all its packets, the internet is smart enough to go back to the original backup copy and get the full message. We used to say, oh, sorry, I didn't get your message. It didn't arrive in my inbox. Now you can't use that excuse, right? It always gets there. And for a while, there are a lot of people who are caught lying with that excuse. Anyway, this is one of the most important diagrams when it comes to aging. And I'm pretty certain that Dr. Shannon here didn't realize that he was working on something just as important as the internet, perhaps even more so. And that's how to reset the age of our bodies. And what you can see here in his diagram from 1948 is that if you lose a message, a signal, a radio signal, or say a Morse code signal between the sender, which he calls the transmitter, and the receiver, if you lose some of that information, don't worry, because there's what he called an observer, the backup copy of that original information, which you can use to restore the information using a correcting device. If that's true in our bodies, we could take the old epigenome and reset it to be young again. But we didn't know what the correcting device was in the cell. The transmitter, of course, is the fertilized egg and us as a young child. The receiver is our bodies in the future, let's say an 80-year-old. And we lose a lot of that information over time. We succumb to entropy. But we are biological organisms. We're not closed systems, we're actually open systems. So we can use energy to reset the system.